morning. This is week 13. This is Watson. Yes, he decided not to join the group, but this is week 13 of the Introduction to the Culture of the 19th Century, and today I'd like to talk with you about the British Empire, and especially the phase in the development of the British Empire in the Victorian period, because as you can imagine, this is a long subject. This is something that could easily become a subject of an entire course and not only one week. So a little bit about the materials. If you get interested, there are lots of interesting books and documentaries for absolute beginners. There is a chapter in the book that I have been using a lot this semester, Sally Mitchell's Daily Life in Victorian England. The last chapter is about England and Empire, so some information about also about the things that we do not really have a lot of time for today, like the organization and the life in the British Army and Navy. So the military life in Victorian England, and there are some interesting changes. Perhaps the most important change being the introduction of promotion based on merit rather than on the money and connections. So something that was definitely a step towards more competent, professional and democratic armed forces than before. Speaking of the British Empire, there are quite a lot of interesting documentaries that you might want to watch if you get interested. One is the PBS documentary called Queen Victoria's Empire. This is probably the easiest to watch. There's a lot of information about other aspects of Victorian life and also the life of the Queen herself, but the focus is on the Empire still. Then there are two documentaries. There were also books based on those documentaries or accompanying these documentaries. Both of them are entitled Empire, and one is by Jeremy Paxman, the same man who wrote the book and hosted the documentary about Victorian painting. So it's called Empire. He mostly travels to the former British colonies, talks to the people, mostly trying to answer the question, what, if anything, especially anything positive, remained after the dissolution of the British Empire in the 20th century. Of course, I don't have to say to you that it's still a controversial subject, and many scholars from especially from the countries that used to be British colonies are very critical of the whole idea. There is an interesting book I read not so long ago, written by an Indian scholar. The title was Inglorious Empire. So the man's name is Shashi Tharoor. So judging by the name, he's probably Indian, and of course his perspective is very critical, and he definitely does not support the views that there was anything at all left after positive left after the empire dissolved in India. So here we have Jeremy Paxman's Empire, and another documentary that I would like to recommend to you, especially if you want to write something on this subject, by Neil Ferguson, also entitled Empire. The subtitle is How Britain Made the Modern World, and there was also a documentary, a BBC documentary. This time the time frame is much broader than the 19th century. So Ferguson, who is generally a historian of economy, so he's more interested in trade, money, and commercial relations, and especially the way they influence the establishment and growth of the British Empire. So he tells the story of the empire from the beginning till the end, more or less. So from the first attempts to join in the geographical exploration and the colonization. So basically from Queen Elizabeth and the first American colonies, British colonies in America. So through the 18th century, which is very important in the development of the British Empire, to the late Victorian period, which is called, sometimes in history it's just called the Age of the Empire, or the Golden Age of the Empire, or the Imperial Age, and this is something that we are going to focus on mostly today, to the dissolution of the British Empire after the two World Wars. Even though the World Wars, as you know, were won by Britain and the coalition, but at least according to Neil Ferguson, the victories were too costly, and the empire basically went bankrupt. They weren't able to center the administration in Britain was not able to support the vast colonial empire anymore. But so that's further reading or further watching if you want. So let's look perhaps a little bit about at the reality of the British Empire, and especially in the 19th century. There are quite a lot of popular images and even stereotypes connected with the British Empire. One very popular phrase is, "It was the empire over which the sun never set." It means it was very large. It was territorially very vast, so there was always daylight at some part of the world that belonged to Britain. So I already mentioned Queen Elizabeth and the first American colonies that would actually fall off before the imperial age ever had the chance to start, because still in the 18th century they would declare independence. Some other important things that happened before the 19th century concerning the British Empire is the establishment of the East India Company, so the trading company that was supposed to create trade routes and to maintain the trade routes. This is something very important, especially in the 18th century, when there is a huge market for luxury products from the exotic parts of the world, products such as tea, porcelain, mostly coming from China, but to some extent also from India, fabrics, silks mostly, but other fabrics as well. So Britain joins the rivalry of other European powers, mostly Spain, the Netherlands and France, and starts to establish itself as as a colonial power. Some of the aspects of the early development of the empire are especially now seen as rather shameful and inglorious, and this especially means slavery. In the Caribbean, for example, where a lot of luxury products were actually produced or grown. The crops such as sugar, tobacco, coffee, they start to be grown in the colonies using slave power. It has to be mentioned that, of course, you may recall that from our talk about the Regency period, so early in the 19th century, before the accession of Queen Victoria, there were legislations limiting and finally outlawing slavery in the entire British Empire, but this was something that is now criticized and seen as a very dark page in the history of Britain. You may recall from last year there was a riot in Bristol when they overthrew a statue of one of the great men of the city of Bristol. Bristol, one of the benefactors of the city who earned his fortune on slave trade. Actually, Bristol was one of the cities that really developed because of the slave trade. Another such port would be Liverpool. So the exploitation of the slaves, also the extermination of the natives. This is something that really starts to be a problem in the 18th century. This unfortunately continued in the 19th because basically speaking, there were two types of colonies throughout the British Empire. There were two types of colonies. There were regular colonies, like the colonies in which Britain only brought in the administrators, the military, and what they did was to exploit the local economy, exploit the local resources, local population was used to produce the goods, and this was the situation, for example, in India. So for a long time, until the middle of the 19th century, this was basically a trading operation rather than anything more engaged politically. So such colonies, later on we have such colonies in Africa, in many places. Generally, the idea is to exploit the materials, the production, and the population already present there. The other type of colonies were the so-called colonies of white settlement. So the colonies that were intended to be sources of additional land for settlement of the British population. Of course, Britain is an island, and it cannot expand its borders even through conquest, because well, you would have to go into continental Europe. It wasn't really very practicable, as the wars with France in the Middle Ages prove. It was almost impossible to keep the British lands in continental Europe. But the population was growing, the country was really progressing in terms of economy and wealth and technology. So there was a large surplus of the population who needed to go somewhere to live. So this was the reason of the creation of the so-called colonies of white settlement. Places such as Canada, originally the American colonies, of course, but by the 19th century they were an independent country. Also the use or the new purpose of the original penal colonies of Australia and New Zealand. So the places that originally were used as the places of exile of criminals and other, I would say, undesirable people from Britain, such as, I don't know, prostitutes, for example. So the courts, this is quite visible in the 18th century. Many people convicted for, especially for less serious crimes, were sentenced to transportation to the colonies, meaning usually Australia or New Zealand, and after serving time in prison they were released and encouraged to settle in those colonies. Also, of course, later on in the Victorian period we have quite a lot of people deciding to emigrate there in search of better living conditions, working conditions, and basically a better life. So these colonies of white settlement faced one big problem, which was the native population. The Native Americans, the Native Australians, the Maori people in New Zealand. These entire ethnic groups. What the British colonists thought of them was that they were basically useless. You couldn't exploit them, so what happened was basically the extermination of the entire tribes of American Indians, as they were then called, or the Aborigines in Australia. Long before the 20th century, there were instances of what today would be called genocide. And the idea, the purpose of it was to vacate the land for the British colonists. So we have those very dark aspects of colonial expansion in Britain, all before the 19th century, but some of them, like the extermination of the native peoples, continuing into the 19th century. So this is really the situation before Victoria comes to the throne, and the problems that she has to face. In the Victorian period, we have really the high point of the British Empire. By the time Victoria came to the throne, England controlled the sea routes, and as Sally Mitchell says, 45% of all world trade. So we have this, Britannia rule the waves thing, really continuing. This was the first country to industrialize, so they had the best ships, they had the best fleet, they needed food and raw materials from the colonies, so this was a massive incentive to grow. What else? The situation is quite chaotic, and much of the expansion happens through trade rather than military conquest. Um, Basically, the situation of different parts of the empire is different sometimes. So in some places, like let's say in Africa, it was connected with geographical exploration, with kind of scientific expeditions, mapping the world, solving all kinds of geographical mysteries, like looking for the sources of the river Nile, or something like that, or trying to establish whether a water route, so the rivers could be used as kind of source of transport across Africa. So we'll talk about it in a little moment. There are quite a lot of stories surrounding the British expansion in this period. We have in some parts more active missionaries, Christian missionaries, trying to Christianize the native population. But again, it's more visible in Africa than, let's say, in India or in the Arab countries. Generally, later on, during Victoria's reign, and especially in the second half of the 19th century, the common consensus was that in case of what the Victorians believed to be advanced and well-developed civilizations, such as, first of all, the Indian civilization, it wasn't proper to try to spread Christianity to the native population. Of course, they were very happy if somebody wanted to convert, and many Indians, especially from the middle class, from the forming middle class, chose that because they thought it would make their careers in colonial administration easier. But generally the idea was that those advanced civilizations should be respected, and there were a lot of Victorians who were clearly fascinated with Arabic culture, with Indian culture, with the Far East, China, Japan. They learned languages, they wanted to read literature, and especially poetry in the original. They brought all kinds of fascinating, exotic things back to England. So there was a fashion for those colonial things, and as we'll talk about in a little moment, the inspirations went both ways. It wasn't like the only attempts of the British was to civilize with whatever effect the colonies. They were also influenced by the cultures and the reality of life in the colonies as well. So in Sally Mitchell's book, you have a long list. It's like a list enumerating all the territories under the British rule at the high point of the empire, so at around the moment of Victoria's death. And it's like half a page of all the place names, mostly relatively small names, like all kinds of islands and archipelagos scattered around the world, but sometimes bigger places, like of course Australia and Canada and South Africa and other such places were visible. So it all culminates in 1876, when Victoria is proclaimed the Empress of India. She gets another title, so she's not only Queen of the United Kingdom, she's also the Empress of India, and we have the imperial age with a lot of ideology and popular culture and legends surrounding it. So we'll talk about it in a moment.